Hello there, and welcome to this quiet corner where time moves slowly and wonder is allowed to unfold at its own pace. Tonight, we're not staying in the present. We're stepping back, far back, to a world that existed just yesterday in geological terms, yet feels as alien as another planet entirely. Imagine this: just 21,000 years ago, you could have walked from London to Paris without ever getting your feet wet. The English Channel didn't exist as we know it. Instead, vast grasslands stretched where ships now sail, and enormous creatures moved across landscapes that are now buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water. This isn't science fiction. This is Earth during the last glacial maximum, when our planet wore a completely different face, and survival meant something entirely different than it does today. If you've ever wondered what it would feel like to wake up on an alien world, you don't need to look to distant stars. You only need to look back 20,000 years to your own planet, transformed by ice into something both beautiful and terrifying. Tonight, we're going to walk through that world together, slowly, quietly, letting our imagination fill in the spaces between what science has discovered and what it felt like to breathe that ancient air. Whether you're here to learn something new before sleep finds you, or simply to let your mind wander through landscapes that no human eye will ever see again, I'm glad you're here. And if this kind of gentle journey through deep time feels like home to you, consider staying a while. There are more questions waiting, more worlds to explore, and time enough to wonder about them all. So settle in, let your thoughts slow to the pace of glacial ice, and let's begin our journey into a world where everything familiar becomes strange, and everything we think we know about Earth reveals itself to be just one temporary arrangement among countless others. To understand what Earth looked like during the Ice Age, we first need to let go of almost everything we think we know about our planet's geography. The world map hanging on your wall, the one you learned in school, the familiar shapes of continents separated by familiar oceans, none of that existed 20,000 years ago, not in the way we know it. The numbers alone are staggering, but they don't capture the full picture. During the last glacial maximum, the average global temperature was 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. That might not sound like much after all. That's just the difference between a cool morning and a warm afternoon. But on a planetary scale, 6 degrees is the difference between the world we know and something unrecognizable. Permanent ice covered 30% of Earth's land surface. Not the small ice caps we see today, but continental ice sheets that stretched across thousands of kilometers, some reaching thicknesses of several kilometers. Imagine standing in what is now New York City and looking north to see an endless wall of white ice stretching to the horizon, rising hundreds of meters into the sky like a frozen mountain range that had no end. This wasn't just snow that would melt in spring. These were glaciers so massive they pressed the very bedrock beneath them downward, reshaping the continental shelves. The weight of ice over what is now Hudson Bay was so immense that the land is still slowly rising today, thousands of years after the ice melted, like a mattress slowly returning to its original shape after a heavy sleeper finally gets up. But perhaps the most dramatic change wasn't what the ice covered, but what it revealed. With so much water locked away in these continental glaciers, sea levels dropped by more than 400 feet. 400 feet. That's the height of a 40-story building, all of it missing from the oceans. This drop exposed vast areas of the continental shelf that had been underwater for millions of years. Suddenly, land bridges appeared, where none exist today. The Bering Strait vanished, replaced by a landmass called Beringia that was roughly the size of Texas and California combined. You could walk from Siberia to Alaska across grasslands dotted with lakes and rivers. The English Channel disappeared, allowing free movement between Britain and continental Europe across what archaeologists now call Doggerland, a vast plain that is now beneath the North Sea. Southeast Asia looked completely different too. What we now know as Indonesia was connected to the mainland by a massive landmass called Sunderland. Islands became mountains on a vast continent. The familiar geography of our world simply didn't exist. And it wasn't just the coastlines that changed. The climate itself created landscapes unlike anything we see today. Much of what is now lush forest or fertile farmland was either buried under ice or transformed into something resembling a cold desert. The American Midwest, now some of the most productive agricultural land on Earth, was a wind-swept plain where massive dust storms could rage for days, kicking up particles that would travel thousands of kilometers before settling. The atmosphere itself was different. Dust levels were 20 to 25 times higher than today, creating hazy skies that would have made sunsets and sunrises appear dramatically different from our modern experience. The air was thin and dry, with far less precipitation than we're accustomed to. Rain was rare, snow even rarer in many regions. The world was not just cold, it was parched. Yet life persisted, not just barely hanging on, but in some places thriving in ways that seem almost impossible to imagine. This harsh alien Earth supported ecosystems more diverse and productive than almost anything we see in the modern world. The key was adaptation, not just individual adaptation, but entire ecological communities that evolved together to make the most of conditions that would seem impossibly harsh to us. If you could step back in time and stand on the grasslands that stretched from Western Europe all the way across Siberia to Alaska, you would find yourself in the middle of Earth's most extensive ecosystem, one that no longer exists anywhere on our planet. This was the Mammoth Steppe, and it was unlike anything in our modern world. Picture a landscape that combined the productivity of the African savanna with the harsh beauty of the Arctic tundra, but was somehow more alive than either. The Mammoth Steppe wasn't the moss-covered, boggy tundra we see in Alaska and northern Canada today. Instead, it was a rich grassland ecosystem that could support enormous numbers of large animals so big and so numerous that their modern equivalents seem like miniature shadows by comparison. The secret to the Mammoth Steppe's incredible productivity lay in a unique combination of environmental factors that existed only during the Ice Age. The climate was cold enough to prevent trees from taking over, but dry enough to prevent the formation of the peat bogs and moss-dominated landscapes that characterize modern tundra. Without trees to shade the ground, and without waterlogged soils to limit root growth, grasses and herbs could flourish. But these weren't just any grasses. The vegetation was dominated by highly nutritious species, wild rye, bluegrass, fescue, and countless varieties of herbs that provided far more energy per bite than the sparse vegetation of today's Arctic. The plant communities were incredibly diverse, with warm climate and cold climate species somehow coexisting in the same landscape. Sagebrush grew alongside Arctic willows. Alpine flowers bloomed near hardy sedges. It was as if nature had found a way to compress multiple ecosystems into one incredibly rich tapestry. The productivity of this ecosystem is hard to comprehend from our modern perspective. Estimates suggest that the Mammoth Steppe supported about 100 times more large animal biomass than today's Arctic regions. 100 times. That means where you might see a single caribou today, the Ice Age landscape would have supported the equivalent of 100 large animals. And what animals they were. This wasn't just a scaled-up version of modern ecosystems, it was home to creatures that seemed to belong more in mythology than natural history. The most famous resident of this lost world was, of course, the woolly mammoth, but the word mammoth barely begins to capture what these animals were like in reality. Standing 12 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing up to 8 tons, they were living mountains of muscle and fur, covered in shaggy hair that could grow 3 feet long in the harsh Arctic cold. Their massive curved tusks, some reaching 15 feet in length, weren't just impressive displays, they were sophisticated tools. Mammoths use their tusks like snowplows, clearing away snow to reach the nutritious grasses beneath. They were living excavators, reshaping the landscape with every meal. A single mammoth needed to eat for 16 to 18 hours a day, consuming enough vegetation to fill a small truck. Their constant grazing and trampling helped maintain the grassland ecosystem, preventing it from becoming the boggy tundra we see today. But mammoths weren't solitary giants. They moved in herds, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, across landscapes where their modern elephant cousins would quickly perish. The sound of a mammoth herd on the move must have been extraordinary. A low rumbling that could be felt through the ground for kilometers, mixed with trumpeting calls that echoed across the open steppe. And they weren't alone. The mammoth steppe was home to an entire community of giants that would seem impossible if we didn't have their bones to prove they once existed. There were cave lions, though. They weren't actually cave-dwelling that were 25% larger than modern lions. These weren't the golden-maned cats of Africa, but shaggy, powerful predators adapted to Arctic conditions, capable of bringing down prey much larger than anything modern big cats attempt. Short-faced bears roamed these grasslands too, standing over 12 feet tall on their hind legs. These weren't the relatively gentle black bears, or even the impressive grizzlies we know today. They were hyper-carnivores, specialized meat-eaters, with long legs built for running down prey across open ground. Imagine a bear with the proportions of a greyhound, but the size of a small elephant. Perhaps most surprising of all were the giant ground sloths. Today's sloths are small, slow-moving tree dwellers, but their Ice Age relatives were the size of elephants. They could rear up on their hind legs to reach heights of 12 feet, using massive claws, some over a foot long, to strip bark and leaves from trees. Despite their fearsome appearance, they were gentle giants, perfectly adapted to a world where size meant survival. The diversity was staggering. There were horses, but not like the horses we know today. These were stockier, shaggier creatures, adapted to cold climates. There were bison, but not the plains bison of North America. These were steppe bison, larger and more robust, with massive horns and thick coats. There were camels in Alaska, giant beavers the size of black bears, and saber-toothed cats with 7-inch canine teeth. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these giants wasn't their size or their fearsome appearance. It was how recently they disappeared. The last woolly mammoths didn't die out at the end of the Ice Age. Small populations survived on remote Arctic islands until just 4,000 years ago. That means there were still mammoths alive when the ancient Egyptians were building the pyramids, when Stonehenge was already ancient, when human civilization was already thousands of years old. To understand what the Ice Age world looked like, we need to think about ice not just as frozen water, but as one of the most powerful geological forces our planet has ever known. The ice sheets of the last glacial maximum weren't just large, they were architectural, reshaping continents and creating landscapes that still influence our world today. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of Canada and the northern United States, was at its thickest points single mass of ice, larger than Antarctica today. It was over 3 kilometers deep. Imagine ice stacked as high as 10 Empire State Buildings. The weight of this ice was so immense that it pressed the Earth's crust downward by hundreds of meters. Hudson Bay exists today not because it was carved by water, but because it was pressed into existence by the sheer weight of ice. But ice doesn't just sit there. It moves, flows, carves, and carries. These massive ice sheets were in constant motion, grinding their way across the landscape like continental-sized bulldozers. They carved out the Great Lakes, gouged thousands of smaller lakes across the Canadian Shield, and transported massive boulders hundreds of kilometers from their origins. The ice created its own weather systems. Cold air would cascade off the ice sheets like invisible waterfalls, creating fierce winds that could reach hurricane force. These katabatic winds picked up dust and debris, creating dust storms that could last for weeks. The dust would travel incredible distances, Particles from Ice Age glaciers in North America have been found in sediment cores from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Along the edges of these ice sheets, a completely different world existed. These were the periglacial zones, areas that weren't covered by ice but were profoundly shaped by its presence. Here, the ground was permanently frozen to great depths, creating a landscape of permafrost that extended far south of the ice sheets themselves. In Europe, permafrost reached as far south as present-day Hungary. The ground was locked solid for most of the year, but during the brief summer months, only the top few centimetres would thaw, creating a boggy surface layer over rock-hard frozen ground. This sea today created unique landscapes that we rarely solifluction terraces formed, where the thin layer of thawed soil would slowly flow downhill over the frozen ground beneath, creating stepped hillsides that looked almost artificial. Pingo's ice-cored hills would push up from the permafrost, creating strange dome-shaped landmarks scattered across the tundra. But perhaps most dramatically, the ice sheets created their own wind patterns that affected the entire planet. The massive high-pressure systems over the ice sheets deflected storm tracks, creating deserts in places that are lush today and bringing moisture to regions that are now dry. The southwestern United States, now largely desert, was dotted with large lakes during the Ice Age. Lake Bonneville, of which the Great Salt Lake is a tiny remnant, was larger than Lake Erie. As we continue our journey through this transformed world, we begin to see how every aspect of Earth's systems, its climate, its landscapes, its living communities, were interwoven in ways that created something entirely unique. The Ice Age wasn't just our world with more ice. It was a fundamentally different planet, operating under different rules, supporting different kinds of life, and offering different possibilities for the future. The story of this lost world raises profound questions about permanence and change, about what we consider normal and what we consider possible. And perhaps most intriguingly, it reminds us that the stable, familiar world we know today is itself just one temporary arrangement in the long, restless story of our planet. But what did it mean to be alive in such a world? How did the few humans who existed then manage to not just survive, but thrive in conditions that would challenge our most advanced modern technology? And what happened to bring this entire world to an end? Those questions await us as we continue deeper into the story of Earth's Ice Age, a story that's far from over, since we're still living in an ice age today, just in one of its warmer interludes. Planet will once again transform into something we. The ice may return, and when it does, I can barely recognise, but that's a story for another time, in another quiet corner where wonder is allowed to unfold slowly, and deep time reveals its secrets to those patient enough to listen. In this vast tapestry of ice and giants, there was another presence, so small and seemingly insignificant that it would have been easy to overlook entirely. Yet this presence carried within it something that would ultimately outlast the mammoths, the cave lions, and even the great ice sheets themselves. These were the humans of the Ice Age, and their story is perhaps the most remarkable of all. Picture a small band of perhaps 30 people moving carefully across the wind-swept grasslands of what would one day become France. The year is 18,000 years ago, though of course they have no concept of years as we understand them. Time for them is measured in seasons, in the migration patterns of animals, in the slow wheel of stars overhead. They are not the primitive, grunting caricatures that popular culture often portrays. These are people like us in every way that matters, capable of love and loss, of planning and dreaming, of creating beauty for its own sake. Their brains are identical to ours. Their capacity for language, for abstract thought, for artistic expression is indistinguishable from what we possess today. The only difference is the world they inhabit and the extraordinary adaptations they've developed to survive in it. Every member of this small group is essential. There are no specialists here, no one who can afford to focus on just one skill. The woman who naps flint points with surgical precision also knows which berries are safe to eat in late autumn. The man who can track a wounded mammoth for 3 days across broken terrain also knows how to weave grass fibers into rope, strong enough to secure a shelter against Arctic winds. Their clothing is a marvel of engineering that would impress modern designers. Multiple layers of carefully prepared animal hides, each serving a specific function. An inner layer of soft rabbit fur against the skin, a middle layer of reindeer hide for insulation, an outer shell of mammoth hide for protection against wind and moisture. Their boots are works of art, waterproof, insulated, and flexible enough to allow the delicate footwork needed to traverse icy terrain without making noise that might alert prey or predators. But perhaps most remarkably, they carry with them something that no other animal possesses the ability to hold tomorrow in their minds today. They can imagine possibilities that don't yet exist, plan for contingencies weeks or months in the future, and pass down knowledge that will benefit generations not yet born. When they make camp each evening, they don't just find shelter, they create a temporary home. They know exactly how to position their tents to minimize wind exposure while maximizing warmth from their carefully tended fires. They understand the subtle art of fire management in a world where fuel is precious and mistakes can be fatal. A fire too large wastes precious wood and might attract unwanted attention from predators. A fire too small won't provide enough warmth or light to perform the endless tasks that keep the group alive. Around these fires, as the long Arctic night settles over their camp, they engage in the activity that perhaps most distinguishes them from every other species. On Earth they tell stories. These aren't just entertainment, though they certainly serve that function during the dark months when hunting is difficult and food stores run low. These stories are their libraries, their schools, their newspapers and history books, all rolled into one. An elder might recount the great mammoth hunt of 3 summers ago, but embedded in that narrative are crucial lessons about tracking, about weather patterns, about the behaviour of wounded animals, about cooperation under stress. A young mother might sing a lullaby to her infant, but woven into that melody are the landmarks that will guide the child if they ever become separated from the group. These stories travel. When 2 bands meet perhaps at a summer gathering near a reliable water source, stories are exchanged like currency. News travels across continents at the speed of human footsteps and horseback rides. A particularly harsh winter, in what would one day be called Siberia, becomes known to people camping in prehistoric Spain. A successful hunting technique developed by one group spreads across thousands of kilometers of steppe and tundra. And slowly, generation by generation, these small bands of humans are mapping their world. Not on paper or hide, for they have no writing systems, but in the collective memory of their people. They are creating mental atlases of unimaginable precision, tracking the seasonal movements of animal herds, the locations of water sources, the paths through mountain passes that will be free of snow at different times of year. Some of their journeys were epic in scope. Archaeological evidence suggests that some groups travelled thousands of kilometres, following game trails and seasonal resources across landscapes that would challenge modern expeditions equipped with GPS and satellite phones. They crossed the exposed Bering Land Bridge from Asia into North America, becoming the first humans to set foot on an entire continent. They navigated the edge zones between the great ice sheets, finding passages through terrain that existed for only brief periods when ice patterns shifted. But they were more than just skilled survivors. In the depths of caves across Europe, they were creating some of humanity's first great artworks. By flickering torchlight, artists who had never seen a photograph or a painting were somehow capturing the essence of movement in their drawings of horses and bison. They were mixing pigments from ochre and charcoal, creating colours that still glow on cave walls 30,000 years later. These weren't crude scribbles. These were sophisticated artistic expressions that demonstrate a deep understanding of proportion, perspective, and the use of natural cave contours to create 3-dimensional effects. The artists knew their subjects intimately, every muscle and sinew of a charging mammoth, every detail of a cave lion's hunting posture. And perhaps most mysteriously, they were leaving handprints. Thousands of them, scattered across cave walls throughout Europe. These weren't random marks. They were deliberate, often arranged in patterns that suggest meaning we can't quite decipher. When you place your hand over one of these prints in a cave in southern France, you're touching across 30,000 years of time. The person who left that mark had hopes and fears, loved ones and enemies, dreams and disappointments, just as real and intense as your own. But even as these small bands of humans were slowly spreading across the continents, learning to thrive in one of the harshest environments Earth had ever produced, the world around them was beginning to change. The change started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Summers grew slightly longer, winters became marginally less severe. The great ice sheets, which had dominated the planet for nearly 100,000 years, began their slow retreat. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. The transition from the Ice Age to the world we know today took thousands of years, a blink of an eye in geological terms, but many lifetimes from a human perspective. For the people living through it, the changes would have been subtle, noticeable mainly to the elders who could remember when winters lasted longer and the herds were larger. But for the great megafauna that had ruled the Ice Age world, these gradual changes spelled doom. The mammoth steppe, that incredibly productive ecosystem that had supported such massive herds of giant animals, began to fragment and disappear. As temperatures rose and precipitation patterns shifted, the unique combination of conditions that had created this lost paradise vanished. Trees began to grow where none had grown for millennia. The open grasslands that had stretched unbroken from Europe to Alaska became broken up by forests. The specialized grasses and herbs that had provided such nutritious forage were slowly replaced by the mosses and low shrubs that characterized today's tundra. The productivity of the land plummeted. For the giants of the Ice Age, this was catastrophic. A mammoth needs enormous quantities of a high-quality vegetation to survive. As the nutrient-rich plants of the mammoth steppe disappeared, replaced by the sparse vegetation of modern tundra, the carrying capacity of the land dropped dramatically. Herds that had numbered in the thousands were reduced to hundreds, then dozens. The predators followed their prey into oblivion. Without massive herds of herbivores to sustain them, the great carnivores of the Ice Age began to disappear. Cave lions, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats all found themselves without adequate prey in a rapidly changing world. But the warming climate wasn't the only pressure these animals faced. Those small bands of humans, armed with increasingly sophisticated tools and hunting techniques, were becoming more efficient predators. A single well-coordinated human hunting party could bring down a mammoth that represented months of food for their entire band. Archaeological sites from the end of the Ice Age show evidence of massive kill sites where dozens of large animals were slaughtered and processed. The combination was lethal. Climate change reduced the food available to support large populations of megafauna, while human hunting pressure targeted the remaining animals with unprecedented efficiency. Species that had survived previous climate shifts, that had adapted to countless changes over millions of years, found themselves unable to cope with this particular combination of pressures. The extinction wasn't uniform or immediate. Different species disappeared at different times, in different places. In North America, most of the megafauna vanished around 13,000 years ago. In northern Eurasia, some species held on longer. The last mammoth survived on isolated Arctic islands until just 4,000 years ago, a small population clinging to existence on what is now Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia. Imagine being one of the last mammoths, part of a herd of perhaps a few dozen animals, on a small island in the Arctic Ocean. Your species had once numbered in the millions, had shaped entire continents, had been one of the most successful large mammals, in Earth's history. Now you are among the final members of an ancient lineage, living on an island that was itself a remnant of the vast land bridge that had once connected continents. The loss was staggering. In North America alone, around 80% of large mammal species vanished. Across the globe, the megafauna that had defined the Ice Age world disappeared with shocking rapidity. Within a few thousand years, an instant in evolutionary terms, the Earth lost its giants. What remained was a world that, while recovering from the ice, was somehow diminished. The great herds were gone. The massive predators were gone. The incredible productivity of the mammoth steppe was gone. In their place was a world that looked more familiar to us, but that was, in many ways, just a pale shadow of what had come before. The humans survived, of course. More than survived, they thrived. As the ice retreated and forests expanded, as the climate became more predictable and resources more abundant, human populations began to grow. They developed agriculture, built permanent settlements, created civilizations. They became us. But sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, it's worth remembering what was lost. To imagine standing on a hill overlooking grasslands that stretched to the horizon, watching herds of massive, shaggy creatures moving like living mountains across a landscape that no human eye will ever see again. To picture a world so different from our own that it might as well have been another planet, yet was the same Earth we call home today. The great megafauna may be gone, but they didn't disappear without leaving traces. Across the northern regions of our planet, the bones of these ancient giants continue to emerge from the thawing permafrost, like messages from a lost world. In Siberia, mammoth tusks are so common that they support a thriving ivory trade. In Alaska, gold miners regularly uncover the frozen remains of steppe bison and cave lions. In the tar pits of Los Angeles, the bones of saber-toothed cats and giant ground sloths lie stacked in layers, testament to the abundance of life that once existed there. But the most remarkable discoveries are the rare instances where entire animals have been preserved, frozen in the permafrost for tens of thousands of years. When these mummified remains are uncovered, they offer us windows into a world that would otherwise exist only in our imagination. The baby mammoth named Lyuba, discovered in Siberia in 2007, was so perfectly preserved that she still had her last meal visible in her stomach milk from her mother, mixed with the bacteria that help young mammals digest solid food. Her trunk still bore the wrinkles and folds that had developed during her brief life 42,000 years ago. Her eyelashes were intact. When researchers examined her, they could see that she had died by drowning in mud, probably while trying to drink from a riverbank that collapsed beneath her weight. These discoveries do more than just confirm what we know from bones and teeth. They reveal details about how these animals lived, what they ate, how they interacted with their environment. Pollen analysis of mammoth stomach contents shows us exactly what plants grew on the mammoth steppe. DNA analysis reveals family relationships between individual animals. Even parasites preserved in their digestive systems tell us about the complex ecosystems these creatures inhabited. But perhaps the most poignant traces of the Ice Age world are found not in the remains of the animals themselves, but in the art left by the humans who shared their world. In caves across Europe, the walls are covered with images of creatures that no living human has ever seen. These aren't stylized or symbolic representations. They are portraits created by artists who knew these animals as intimately as a modern wildlife photographer knows the subjects they spend years following. The horses painted in Chauvet Cave in France aren't generic horses. They are clearly the stocky, thick-maned horses of the Ice Age steppe. The cave lions prowling across the walls of Lascaux are anatomically perfect, every muscle and bone rendered with scientific precision. The mammoth in the cave at Rouffignac shows not just the creature's massive bulk, but the intelligent, almost human expression in its eye. These artists were working by firelight, deep underground, in conditions that would challenge modern painters with electric lights and prepared canvases. Yet they created works of art that rival anything produced in the centuries since. They captured not just the appearance of these animals, but their essence, the power of a charging rhinoceros, the grace of a running horse, the dignity of a mammoth bull protecting his herd. When the last of the great cave painters put down their brushes, they were recording the end of an era. The animals they painted so lovingly were already becoming rare. The world that had nurtured both human creativity and megafaunal abundance was drawing to a close. Their art stands now as both celebration and elegy, honouring a community of life that existed once and will never exist again. Today, as we walk through landscapes that seem permanent and unchanging, it can be difficult to remember that we are still living in an ice age. The great ice sheets may have retreated, but they have not disappeared. Greenland and Antarctica still hold enough frozen water to raise sea levels by more than 60 meters if they were to melt completely. The ice caps on mountains around the world, the glaciers flowing down from the peaks into valleys, the permafrost underlying vast areas of the Arctic, all of these are remnants of the Ice Age that transformed our planet. But more than physical remnants, the Ice Age lives on in subtler ways. The Great Lakes of North America are scars left by glacial action. The fertile soils of the American Midwest are largely composed of sediments ground up and deposited by ice sheets. The fjords of Norway, the lochs of Scotland, the Finger Lakes of New York, all were carved by glacial ice. Even the distribution of life on Earth still bears the fingerprint of the Ice Age. Many plant and animal species that we think of as naturally occurring together were actually thrown into proximity by the advancing and retreating ice. As the climate changed, species had to migrate, sometimes thousands of kilometers, to find suitable habitat. Some made the journey successfully, others didn't. The patterns of human culture, too, were shaped by the Ice Age experience. The deep human need for story, for art, for meaning, making that transcends mere survival. These may have been forged in the long dark winters when small bands of humans huddled around fires, creating the narratives that would bind them together and help them make sense of their harsh but beautiful world. Our myths and legends are full of giants, of magical creatures, of golden ages when the world was different and more wonderful than it is today. Perhaps these stories, passed down through countless generations, preserve some ancestral memory of a time when giants really did walk the earth, when the world was indeed stranger and more magnificent than anything we know today. And still, the ice shapes our future. Climate scientists warn that our current interglacial period, the warm interval between ice ages that has allowed human civilization to flourish, may be drawing to a close. Whether through natural cycles or human influence, the Earth's climate is changing once again. The ice may return, or it may disappear entirely, creating a world as different from ours as ours is from the Mammoth steppe. Either way, the story of the Ice Age reminds us that nothing about our world is permanent. The familiar landscapes we call home, the comfortable climates we take for granted, the stable ecosystems we depend upon, all of these are temporary arrangements in the long, restless story of our planet. What seems eternal to us is just a moment in the life of a world that has seen ice sheets advance and retreat dozens of times, has watched continents drift and collide, has supported forms of life so strange we can barely imagine them. As our journey through the Ice Age world draws toward a close, it's worth asking what we can learn from this lost chapter of Earth's history. What does it mean that our planet was once home to creatures so magnificent that they seem mythical to us today? What does it tell us about the nature of life, of change, of loss and adaptation? Perhaps the first lesson is about the power of community. The great megafauna of the Ice Age didn't survive as isolated individuals. They lived in herds, in packs, in complex social networks that spanned continents. The mammoths that weathered the harsh steppe winters did so by working together, sharing knowledge about food sources and safe passages, protecting their young collectively, mourning their dead together. The humans of that era survived through even more intensive cooperation. In a world where a broken leg could mean death for an entire family, where a failed hunt could doom a whole band to starvation, survival depended absolutely on the willingness of individuals to sacrifice for the group. The archaeological record shows evidence of humans caring for disabled members of their communities, of sharing resources even when those resources were desperately scarce, of maintaining complex networks of mutual aid across vast distances. The second lesson is about adaptation and resilience. The species that survived the Ice Age weren't necessarily the largest or the strongest. They were the most flexible. They were the ones that could change their behaviour, their diet, their habitat when conditions demanded it. The brown bears that learned to fish for salmon in icy streams. The wolves that developed new hunting strategies for open terrain. The humans that invented new tools, new shelters, new ways of storing and preparing food. But the Ice Age also teaches us about the fragility of even the most successful adaptations. The mammoth had survived multiple climate shifts over millions of years. The saber-toothed cat had been one of the most successful predators in Earth's history. The giant ground sloths had thrived for millions of years across 2 continents. Yet when faced with a particular combination of pressures, climate change coupled with human hunting, even these supremely adapted creatures couldn't survive. This offers a sobering perspective on our own moment in Earth's history. We humans have been extraordinarily successful. We've spread to every continent, adapted to every climate, learned to manipulate our environment in ways no other species ever has. We've created art, music, literature, philosophy. We've unlocked the secrets of DNA, split the atom, sent machines to other planets. Yet the history of the Ice Age reminds us that success, no matter how complete it seems, is always temporary. The mammoth steppe, that incredibly productive ecosystem that supported such abundance of life, disappeared not because it was poorly adapted, but because the conditions that created it changed. The giants that ruled that world vanished not because they were weak, but because the world they were adapted to no longer existed. And perhaps that leads us to the deepest lesson of all, the importance of humility in the face of time and change. The Ice Age world lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, far longer than human civilization has existed. Yet it passed away, leaving only traces in ice and stone, and the fading memories preserved in ancient art. Our world too will pass. The familiar geography of our continents, the comfortable patterns of our climate, the rich diversity of life. We know today all of it is temporary, just another arrangement in the endless dance of matter and energy and time. This doesn't make it less precious. If anything, it makes it more so. The humans who painted mammoths on cave walls 30,000 years ago knew something about impermanence. They lived in a world where winter could kill, where herds could disappear, where the ice could advance or retreat with consequences that lasted for generations. Yet they created art of stunning beauty, told stories that sustained their communities, raised children with love and hope. They understood, perhaps better than we do, that meaning doesn't come from permanence. It comes from presence, from attention, from the willingness to see beauty and create connection even in the midst of uncertainty and change. As we lie here tonight, safe in our warm homes, protected by technologies and institutions that would seem like magic to those ancient artists, we might remember their gift to us. Not just the knowledge of how to survive in a harsh world, but the deeper wisdom of how to live fully in whatever world we find ourselves in. The Ice Age is gone, but its lessons remain. In the cycles of climate and ecosystem, in the rise and fall of species, in the long dance of ice and stone and life, we can read something like a manual for existence on a restless planet. Be adaptable. Take care of each other. Pay attention to the world around you. Create beauty when you can. Tell stories that matter. Remember that everything changes, and change is not to be feared. It is simply the nature of being alive in a universe that never stops moving. The mammoths are gone, but their memory teaches us something about dignity in the face of an uncertain future. The cave painters are gone, but their art teaches us something about the human capacity to find meaning and create beauty, even in the darkest times. The Ice Age world is gone, but its story teaches us something about our place in the vast, ongoing experiment of life on Earth. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything. Tomorrow, when you wake in the world, we know a world of forests and cities, of familiar animals and comfortable climates. You might remember for a moment the world that was. The grasslands that stretched from horizon to horizon, the giants that moved like living mountains across landscapes we'll never see. The small bands of humans who survived and dreamed and painted by firelight in caves that echo still with their presence. That world lives on in our bones, in our DNA, in the deep structures of our minds that were forged in the long winter of the ice. We are their descendants, carriers of their resilience, inheritors of their wonder. And in the quiet moments before sleep, in the spaces between one breath and the next, we might feel the presence of that older world, vast, strange, beautiful, and gone. But not entirely gone, never entirely gone, because we remember. And in remembering, we keep alive something essential about what it means to be human on a planet that has always been, and will always be, in motion. The Ice Age world reminds us that Earth has worn many faces and will wear many more. Our current world, this brief, warm moment between ice ages, is just one chapter in a story that began billions of years ago and will continue long after we're gone. But it's our chapter, and like those ancient artists painting by firelight on cave walls, we have the chance to make it beautiful, to make it meaningful, to make it worthy of being remembered. The mammoths may be gone, but the wonder remains. The ice has retreated, but the mystery deepens. And in that mystery, in that endless capacity of our planet to surprise and transform and renew itself, we find not just the history of where we've been, but perhaps a glimpse of where we're going. Sweet dreams, fellow travellers through deep time. Rest well in this warm moment between the ice ages, and dream, if you will, of giants moving across grasslands under ancient stars, and small bands of humans creating beauty by firelight in the long darkness of the world's winter. And when you're ready to continue exploring the deep mysteries of our planet's past, perhaps you'll join me next time as we ask another question that touches the very foundations of existence. What if Earth never had a moon, the alien world we'd call home? Until then, sleep peacefully, and remember, we are all children of the ice, inheritors of wonder, and participants in the greatest story ever told, the ongoing adventure of life on Earth. The giants may have vanished, but they left us more than just bones in the permafrost and paintings on cave walls. They left us a planet transformed, shaped by their presence in ways we're only beginning to understand. When the last mammoth fell silent on Wrangel Island 4,000 years ago, it wasn't just the end of a species, it was the closing of a chapter in Earth's biography that had been written by the footsteps of giants. Consider for a moment the grasslands where you might walk today. In many parts of the world, those grasslands exist because massive herbivores once grazed there. Their constant trampling and fertilization, maintaining open landscapes that might otherwise have become forests. The great herds of the Ice Age were ecosystem engineers on a scale we can barely comprehend. Each mammoth was a living landscaping machine, its daily activities shaping the very structure of the plant communities around it. When they disappeared, the effects rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Without the constant grazing pressure, without the trampling that kept soils compressed and well drained, without the massive quantities of fertilizer produced by herds numbering in the thousands, the mammoth steppe began to transform into something else entirely. The rich grasslands gave way to the moss-dominated tundra. We see today a landscape that supports perhaps 1/100th the biomass of large animals that once thrived there. It's as if an entire continent had been muted, its capacity for life dramatically reduced by the absence of the creatures that had maintained its productivity for hundreds of thousands of years. But the transformation wasn't just ecological, it was atmospheric. Those vast herds of megafauna weren't just grazing peacefully on the steppes, they were actively participating in global climate regulation. The trampling of countless hooves kept the soil compacted, preventing the formation of the insulating layer of organic matter that now covers much of the Arctic tundra. Without that insulation, the permafrost stayed colder, locking away vast quantities of carbon that are now beginning to thaw and release into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. Some scientists have suggested that if the megafauna had survived, our modern climate might be significantly different. The continued presence of mammoths and other large herbivores might have helped maintain the reflective grasslands that bounce solar energy back into space, rather than the dark forests and tundra that absorb it. In a very real sense, the extinction of the Ice Age giants may have contributed to the warming that followed. This reveals something profound about the nature of life on Earth. We often think of climate as something that happens to life, as an external force that organisms must adapt to or perish. But the Ice Age world shows us that life doesn't just respond to climate, it creates it. The great herds of herbivores, the vast grasslands they maintained, the predators that shaped their behaviour, even the tiny soil microbes that processed their waste. All of these were part of a single, integrated system that regulated everything from local temperature to global atmospheric composition. When that system was disrupted, when key species were removed, the entire planetary machinery began to operate differently. We live today not just in a post-Ice Age world, but in a post-megafauna world, shaped as much by absence as by presence. Yet in subtle ways, the memory of that vanished world persists, not just in the fossil record or in ancient art, but in the very structure of the ecosystems that surround us. Many of the plants we see today carry within their genes the memory of a world populated by giants. The massive thorns on honey locust trees, sharp enough to puncture truck tires, evolved to defend against browsers that no longer exist. The tough, fibrous grasses of the American prairies developed their resilience in response to the constant grazing of creatures far larger than the bison that replaced them. Even the scattered groves of trees in grassland landscapes, what ecologists call savanna parklands, may represent the ghostly outlines of ancient refuge areas where vegetation could escape the intensive grazing of Ice Age herbivores. These plants are living fossils in a sense, perfectly adapted to ecological relationships that no longer exist. They're like letters written in a language no one speaks anymore, messages from a world we can no longer fully read, but can sense in the spaces between what we understand. The same is true for many of the predators that survived the Great Extinction. Modern wolves, bears, and big cats are all descended from species that evolved to hunt megafauna. Their hunting strategies, their pack behaviours, their physical capabilities were all honed in a world where prey animals weighed tons rather than hundreds of pounds. In some ways, today's predators are overbuilt for the world they inhabit, carrying within their genes the blueprints for a more dangerous and magnificent existence. Even we humans bear the marks of our Ice Age heritage, our capacity for cooperation, for long-term planning, for creating meaning through story and art. All of these may have been forged in the crucible of survival during Earth's long winter. The same neural pathways that allowed our ancestors to coordinate mammoth hunts now help us coordinate space missions. The same storytelling abilities that once preserved crucial survival information through dark Arctic nights now create the literature and cinema that shape our understanding of ourselves. And so our journey through the Ice Age draws to a gentle close. like the last light fading over an ancient landscape we'll never see again. We've walked together through grasslands that stretched beyond horizons, stood in the shadow of giants that moved like living mountains, and listened to the whispered stories of our ancestors who painted by firelight in caves that echo still with their presence. The mammoths are gone, but their memory lives on in the very soil beneath our feet, in the patterns of plants that still remember their passing, in the deep structures of our minds that were shaped by survival in their world. We carry within us the resilience of those who weathered the long winter, the wonder of those who first looked up at stars through clear, cold air, and the wisdom of those who learned that beauty and meaning can flourish even in the harshest times. Perhaps that's the greatest gift of the Ice Age, not just the knowledge of what was, but the reminder of what's possible when life adapts, persists, and dreams of tomorrow, even in the depths of an endless winter.